Everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Good morning in some instances. My name is Stacey Alvarez. I am the program partnership manager here at Island Innovation. And I'm welcoming on this live stream someone who's a legend in my eyes, actually, Mr. Naidoo. This is Mr. Kumi Naidoo. He is the founding chair of Africans Rising. He is also the former executive director of Greenpeace, as well as the former Secretary General of Amnesty International. And I will say that is a really impressive resume, as it were, Mr. Naidoo. So I wanted to ask, first of all, in terms of your journey, your beginnings, where would you say your beginning of your fascination with, I guess we can say, a commitment to human rights and the environment started?
So a product of the South African liberation struggle, I got involved in the anti-apartheid struggle at the age of 15. To be honest, I didn't know all that much then, but I thought I knew it all. In fact, the slogan at the first march that I was engaged in, which was focused on equality in education, which is a fundamental human rights, the slogan at the front of the march was, "We want equality." By the time the slogan got to the back of the march, the younger kids were chanting, "We want a color TV," because they thought that was what the slogan in the front of the march was. And to be honest with you, at that time, I probably wanted a color TV and equality in education almost equally, and both appeared equally unattainable. So that experience of being involved in a very brutal and unjust sort of living reality under apartheid was what started me off on the journey of standing up and not being silent in the face of injustice that destroys the possibilities of our children and all other parts of society.
I think when you do mention the apartheid struggle, I must say that was some seminal experiences of me in my adolescence growing up. And I like to tease people and say, well, I'm old enough to remember before they had the media blackout in South Africa, when they stopped media from cutting, but the images were absolutely. And I remember thinking that you couldn't imagine that people were experiencing this and that nothing was being done. So that mention of silence, I think, is really important. That silence is the worst kind of oppression, almost.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things we always used to say then, and also is very, very relevant now, is when we say silence and neutrality is a choice, right? It's a difficult choice. It's an easy choice sometimes, in the sense that you think, if I say silent and neutral, then maybe I'll be safe. The police won't come after me and the forces of repression won't come after me, all of that. But we used to say in the struggle, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And if you choose neutrality and silence, sadly, you are choosing to be part of the problem, because governments and corporations that push unjust, oppressive policies are banking on silence. They're banking on people not taking a stand. And when people take a stand, as people are doing now in the face of the climate crisis around the world in large numbers, then you can see that even though it doesn't mean change is easy, but then the possibility of change becomes easy. And in the moment of history that we find ourselves in right now, one of the most important things we need to be saying is that in this moment of history, pessimism and inaction is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And that the pessimism of our analysis, our observation, and the realities in which we live can best be overcome by the optimism of our thought, our creativity, our courage, and our actions.
Yeah, that's very true, and that's really well said, because that leads me, into a conversation about COP28 and what's coming up. And what do you see the role of governments, as it were, in this arena, in terms of making sure that there isn't silence? How do you think they can make sure the message is spread about what matters?
Well, firstly, our governments, both in the global north, in the so-called developed countries of the world, and in the global south, the first thing they can do is to make sure that they're not doing what they are doing, which is in country after country, we're seeing a shrinking of democratic space, and we're seeing specifically a shrinking of civic space. By civic space, I mean freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. So the first thing they can do is create an enabling environment that says democracy is not simply representative democracy where people go and vote once every 4 or 5 years. But for democracy to be meaningful, it needs to be participatory democracy. How do citizens participate actively in public life in between elections, for example? In my community in South Africa, where we've seen a decline of services as a result of corruption by the very movement that I was part of, the ANC, after being 30 years in power, right? We have a complete neglect of basic things, picking up of garbage, filling of potholes, safety and security, and so on. And in my community over the last year, what we've done is we've said, if government won't lead, we will lead from below. So once we started organizing, for example, on cleaning up the garbage, right? Because what the theory of change there was, if we get organized, mobilize ourselves, and start doing what government should do, then we can push for change from below. But when we look at how our governments participate in a forum such as the Conference of the Parties, or COP as it's known in short, around climate, we must recognize that when governments go there, they don't go there as equals. We still have the COP that is heavily dominated by the so-called global north or the developed countries of the world. So, for example, small island states, least developed countries, and so on, have to really, really struggle to get their voice through. And one of the things that people don't generally know is that, you know, the largest delegation to the COP is, in fact, not any country, but it is the fossil fuel industry, right? So if you think about how bizarre that is, right, the very people that are causing the problem and have been causing the problem have been falsifying the science, have been denying the science, have been spending billions of dollars holding back progress, are the largest delegation to a conference of negotiations where, in fact, we have to, you know, get off fossil fuels. You know, that is the absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous holding a global conference, and the largest delegation to that conference is the alcohol industry. So we have, having said that, if the COP didn't exist, we have to create it. And what's and all, we have to push the COP to go beyond what the powers that be in the global north, who played a big role in designing it. And we need to get it to, if you want, outstrip its constraints and do much better than it's doing. And just to say that, you know, on loss and damage, which is a really important issue for small island states and these developed countries, we have not, always we were hearing for decades, oh, we'll never get any decision on loss and damage because rich countries will never agree to their complicity because that will open the floodgates of reparations and so on and so forth. And people always dismissed it. But in Egypt, we did get the loss and damage. We might not get any money.
I know.
I mean, the whole idea of
The
a loss and damage decision is that rich nations should put resources so that they support poor nations when they are suffering major loss and damage, not as the result of their economies or their emissions, but the result of the emissions of countries far away in the global north that built their economies on dirty energy and on fossil fuels. So what I say to young people in particular going into this COP, go in with your eyes open, don't have unrealistic expectations, and don't get sucked in and don't become part of that system. But if you are there, use the opportunity to push as hard as you can to try to educate people globally about what's happening, because governments who are in the negotiation teams in the COP, they are listening to one source of power and one source of power alone. They listen to what their own citizens are saying, right? And so we must not make a disconnection between what's happening at home during those 2 weeks of negotiations and what pressure people are putting on their own governments to take positive decisions there, and what happens at the COP itself.
Yeah, and I think that's really great, because you touched on a point I think is really important. Two really interesting points. The idea of leading from below, and there being that multi-stakeholder engagement in COP, which can become just a bit of a buzzword. But, what would you say is the best way, as you say, to amplify the voices that need to be heard somewhere like COP, that's outside of, say, the governments having their say?
Okay, I'm going to answer this with taking one. There's many ways you can do that, but I wanted to just take one example,
Sure.
which I think is, and that's something that I'm working on right now. If you look at why we are not winning the communications battle to get large enough numbers of people around the world to understand the urgency of the climate crisis and encourage us to act with the urgency that the situation calls for, one of the reasons is that we have a real communications deficit. Objectively speaking, on the one hand, the whole infrastructure of media, who owns it, whether it's state-owned or corporate-owned media, they're not inclined to go against the status quo. So even when some of us have been saying we can build our economies on 100% renewable energy 20 years ago, we were laughed at, never given any coverage and so on. Today, quite late, people are more accepting that we have to go in the direction of 100% renewable energy. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Let's just go back.
But it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to think about, and there's so much to be encompassed in the idea of how we can make your voice heard. I think as well, you also touched on the point that it's a process. It's such a process to from, say, making a pledge or promising and the idea of loss and damage to there actually being an outcome. And I think that the idea of being optimistic and keeping steady in your vision is important.
Yeah, sorry, I remembered where I was going with that. Sorry, it's still very early in the morning and I'm on a bit of a sleep deficit. So one of the things that needs to change is, yes, we can't do much about a communications infrastructure that is state-dominated in some case or corporate-dominated in other cases. But on the subjective side, even if we had a more accessible media reality, we are doing a very bad job of how we frame our narratives and our messages. So if you look at the climate communications in particular, right, it's very facts, figures, science, rationality, policies, proposals, and so on. But if you look at, for example, Donald Trump and the people around him who are taking the world in the direction of fascism, right? They don't worry about the head. They don't aim their messages at the head. They just shoot for the heart, right? What I mean by that is they just completely ignore the facts and they frame the narratives and the messages in a way that weaponizes hate. They are misogynistic, they are racist, they are xenophobic, they're Islamophobic, and all of that. But those always can inflame passions and mobilize clusters of people in a more passionate way than trying to reach everybody through the mind. Because also bear in mind that a lot of the climate conversation is far too jargonistic, far too scientific and so on, which puts even activists off the sleep, right? So in the light of that, we have to recognize that we have to meet people where they are. Right? Now, I'm not saying we need to abandon facts as the Trumps of the world do, right? but we have to stick to facts. But facts don't have to be boring and just talking about 1.5 degrees and 350 parts per million, which doesn't mean anything to 99.99% of the people on the planet. We have to now bring the world of arts and culture together with the world of activism, which some of us are calling energizing artivism, right? We have to meet people in where they live their lives, understand that people are time poor, right? So they don't have time to read big policy documents, even if they have the literacy capabilities. And so we have to now be thinking of breaking the communications deficit by using and harnessing the power of arts and culture to communicate the urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in. Because and the way I would put it, harnessing the full power of arts and culture will not on its own give us a breakthrough of climate action that we need. However, without harnessing the full potential of arts and culture, we don't stand a chance to begin to win the communications challenges and to move us in a direction where we really start putting pressure on governments and businesses, where they move from the rhetoric of action to the reality of action.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point regarding that combining of the head and the heart, and the fact that there has to be sometimes more of an appeal to one, but we definitely have to make sure that there is we're sending the message in a way that people listen, and a way that's relatable. And I think that nexus of arts and culture and climate justice is one that's overlooked a bit too much. And I know that that's something that hopefully we can tap into some more in the future. I think it's absolutely crucial. And we really appreciate you spending your time with us, Kumi. I can't tell you, when you mentioned the ANC, I had this image of getting up as a little girl again, don't want to age myself, watching Nelson Mandela come out of prison live, and thinking I didn't think I would ever see the day that would happen.
Well, neither did many of us.
Right. So I know if I transpose that hope and that thinking to the climate crisis, a breakthrough can happen, but there has to be consistent action through messages like yours and through platforms where we can all hear and listen to each other and engage. So we really appreciate you coming on. I know that it's not easy all the time, but thank you for making the time so much to talk to us. And is there any parting words of wisdom that you'd like to give our audience about COP or your hope for COP28?
So this COP needs to recognize that we are just a few minutes before midnight. The window of opportunity for us to act with decisiveness, with ambition, and with courage is small and is closing fast. And we have to recognize that what is at stake is not saving some ethereal thing called the planet. You know, in our slogans, we say, save the planet, save the environment, save the climate. But this COP must recognize that actually the planet probably doesn't need saving. If we continue on this suicidal trajectory that we are on, the end result is our water resources will be depleted, as it's already happening in parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world. Our soil gets destroyed. We cannot plant food because it gets so hot. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. So everybody who's worried about saving the planet, don't worry too much about that. Recognize that what is at stake here is securing our children and their children's futures. And if we continue on this trajectory, we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And truth be said, if we become extinct as a species, the end result will be that the oceans will recover, the forests will grow back, and so on. So recognize that this COP, like every other COP, but this one more so because that window of opportunity is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And therefore, we can only continue to keep the pressure on our governments and the businesses that hold us back, to push them to recognize that by foot dragging, as they have done at other COPs, by putting the self-interest before the collective interest of our children and their children is a crime against humanity. And let's hope that this COP will have fewer crimes against humanity than we have at virtually every COP, where the action that is needed to be taken to save our children's and their children's future is never taken on the scale that it's needed. And while one might not be necessarily super optimistic that we'll get that outcome, we need to keep pushing and pushing, and for us to recognize that the struggle for justice, whether it's climate justice, environmental justice, gender justice, these are marathons and not sprints. So those of us that are involved will feel disappointed at the end of the COP for sure, but we can pick ourselves up, dust ourselves up and recognize that this struggle is a marathon, and it needs our stamina, our passion, our creativity. And also, let's make sure that while we fight the struggle, we celebrate community, we celebrate each other, we celebrate the courage, and let's also create ways of fighting that enhance joy, enhance happiness, and enhance a sense of community. Because if we are able to do that, we'll get more and more people joining in a way that those who are making decisions at the COP and other such global gatherings will not continue to ignore that which needs to be done urgently to secure the right of people to be able to coexist with nature for centuries and centuries to come. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that it's wonderful to end on a note of celebration. And I love that you touched on, we have to think further on in the future and think about after COP. So thank you so much, Mr. Kumi Naidoo. We are honored and blessed to have you. I mean, it's been an incredible experience to actually get to speak to you in person. As I said, my growing up years, I was shaped and formed as a person from watching the struggles in South Africa. And thank you so much for all that you've done.
Where are you based, by the way?
I'm based in Barbados. In Barbados, so I am one of those.
You're Bayesian.
States. so
yeah, I've been there a couple of times. I don't know whether I'll ever make it back.
Fantastic! I should have known you were, or I would have come to try and visit you.
Does the name Chantal Munro Knight mean anything to you?
Yes, it does. Wow.
Yeah, if you know her, give her my best wishes and a big hug.
I will indeed do that. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. We appreciate it.
Take care. Bye.